All right, so today we're going to talk about Android intents and how we use intents to launch a second activity. So we talked about how to create, manipulate, and work with a single activity. This one will allow us to work with multiple activities using intents. This is going to be like the go-between. And so as I mentioned before the start of the stream, this is a book I highly recommend if you're needing a textbook of some sort. They do have the Kindle book is what I recommend because I can go in there and I can search for keywords. Like if I want to know how to do what the equivalent of a switch statement is in Kotlin, I can look up switch, or I could look up which, or I could look up something that I know about that particular feature, and it'll jump right there. A lot better than trying to source these kind of answers through Stack Overflow. I really like books. I actually purchased a couple books just yesterday, not on Android programming, but in programming in general, mostly architectural books. But I'm a nerd, which is why I like Big Nerd Ranch. They're a bunch of big nerds themselves, so I like those guys. All right, so what are intents? I'm just going to read this really quickly. Intents are objects that can launch additional activities, plus a lot more. So again, intents are going to do a lot more than just launch second activities, and we'll get to that later, but for all intents and purposes, we're going to just use it for a second activity today. We can create them, load them up with new data, and then launch those activities, and those new second activities will have access to that data that we bundle in the intent. We'll show you how this works in a second. We can also pass back to the first activity to launch the second activity. We can pass data back. So again, we have two activities. We can pass data back and forth using intents. They don't only launch activities. They do a whole lot more than just those two things. But so this is just some stuff from the documentation. I will not read this, but if you're interested in looking at it after class, these are kind of the other things that intents do. All right, so I did take this from one of the Big Nerd Ranch books that I was promoting earlier, but this has a great example of a screenshot. So this is a quiz. It's called GeoQuiz. It's geography, but they ask you a question, and you can either say true or false, and then that records the answer, or you can cheat, and if you press cheat, it launches a second activity, and that second activity shows up on the screen on top of the first, obviously not in this configuration, but it does take over the entire screen real estate. And you can say, hey, are you sure you want to do this? And you can hit the back button, which does not cheat, or you can say show answer, and I believe in this implementation, it just shows that text field, that text view, it changes it to what the answer would be if you press the show answer. So change that, or again, you press the back button. If you press back, it takes that top or second activity and dismisses it. So we call this the activity stack. It is managed by an activity manager. We'll get to that probably in a future class, but know that there's some entity out there that's actually handling what activities are showing, and if you pop them off the stack, where do they go? Usually they're destroyed, and then it goes back to the first activity. All right, so show of hands, how many people know that this is an interaction diagram? 5, 6, 7, okay, great. Actually, that's not too bad. And I would have asked you, hey, does anybody know what this is? But it says at the top of the slide. All right, so these are really important because if you're working with a team, especially on larger projects, you'll get into these a whole lot, hopefully, if it's a good team anyway, because what it shows is on the left-hand side, we have our quiz activity. So, we're used to working with activities now. We want to actually work with a second activity, and how does the data pass back and forth between all these different entities? So what we're going to do is, in the quiz activity, we get a reference to the button, and then we have a on-click listener, right? And so when that gets called, we're going to call this middle function, start activity for result. And that's going to send it off to another object called an intent. And that has a few member variables in here. That's how you define that. And the intent, when you say, go ahead and go launch the intent or launch the activity through the intent, it's going to actually go over to the activity manager. So I mentioned that entity before. It's going to go over to the activity manager, and the activity manager is going to be responsible for actually creating and putting on the screen our second activity. And so in this case, it's called cheat activity. So this is going to be our second activity. And then our cheat activity, if you say, yes, show me the answer, it's going to actually set a result that we're going to pass back to that first activity. And we're going to do that via another intent. And then that intent, we say, okay, we're done. We're going to finish the result. We're going to go back to the activity manager. And then that activity manager is going to call on our first activity on activity result. Okay, so if we have time at the end of the class, I'll show you this whole entire thing. But this is actually what's going on behind the scenes under the hood in Android. But essentially, this is like 3 or 4 lines of code. So again, you won't see what happens in its totality. So how do we accomplish all of this stuff? Well, we first create an intent. So we created a value called intent. We set that equal to a constructor that's namely called intent. And we're going to pass it two parameters. The first parameter is going to be what's called an Android context. And anytime I say context, it's going to usually mean the activity that you want to accomplish this task in. So you can actually pass in a reference to another activity, but more or less you're going to use this. So you're going to call this this line of code, that is. You're going to call this line of code inside of your first activity. All right, the second parameter is going to be the class name of the second activity, and then we're going to use a little Kotlin syntax here, which looks a little confusing if you're not used to it, : class.java. And what that basically does is it's going to say, just go get the reference to the class. I don't want an instance of it. I don't need to create an instance of it. I don't need to instantiate it. But here's a reference to the class that I want you to create an activity for. And then there's a little .java, just kind of a little tie-in, because Kotlin works seamlessly with Java, and actually it's an implementation and runs on the same virtual machine as Java. So there's a little bit of exposure to the Java language here, but there's not very many kinds of things like that in Kotlin. So just memorize the syntax. It's not too hard, and the autocomplete comes up pretty well most of the time if you just type in : class. Actually, I think just : will pop up the class. I forget how that works, but you barely even have to remember the syntax. All right, and then once we create that intent, we start the activity. So 2 lines of code, that's all we need. So as I mentioned, the activity, this is just stuff, this is review. We're going to skip over because we're a little short on time today. All right, but what if I want to pass some kind of data to that second activity? Maybe I have a car maintenance application, and I want to update the mileage on it. Well, the mileage is all stored in that first activity, and then I want to update the mileage, but I need to know what mileage to display in that second activity. I can pass that number to the second activity. So in this case, we have, in our intent, this is just the declaration of it. In that intent we created back here, so val intent, we would call intent.putExtra. And this is an overloaded method that'll accept strings, ints, floats, you name it. And you can take, that first parameter is always a string, but that value, it can be a float, can be an int, as I mentioned. The first one is a key. So this is going to be a hash map, an associative array, a dictionary, whatever you want to call it. And I'm going to call that string constant maybe just mileage, right? And I'm going to set the value here. So maybe mileage is equal to, let's say, 30,000 miles. I'm going to put that into the intent, and then I'm going to launch the activity with that intent, and then my second activity will have access to it. We're going to skip through these really quickly. So here's an implementation of the second activity. So in the second activity, we also call onCreate. If you remember our activities lifecycle, onCreate gets called. We're not going to actually use the save instance state in this case, though. If you wanted to save the interface state, then you could. But instead what we're going to do is we're going to get the intent and just call intent. This is part of activity. So all activities have a member variable called intent. And then on that, we're going to call an explicit method, either get string, get int, get string extra, get int extra, get float extra, whatever your value is. And then we're going to pass in that key. So our key in my example was called mileage. And so if that exists, that'll come back and that'll get assigned to, in this particular case, string from activity of type string, of course. And then in the second variable the second line of code here as an example, I am getting a serializable object. So in case you want to pass a whole object, I have a person object. So I have a class in here somewhere. Again, this is just an example, but I have a person class, and I want to shove that into the intent and then pull that back out of the intent. This is actually really bad practice. You don't want to be sticking whole objects inside of intents. Really, intents are the best practice is to just use like IDs or references or something like that, and then go get those elsewhere, because again, you don't want to be passing huge chunks of data in between your intents. All right, so what we can do is if we want to, that's a one-way interaction. So we're passing from the first activity to the second activity, that data, but what if we want to pass data back from the second activity to the first? Well, we have to, instead of start activity, if you remember from our code here, where we just simply say start activity and pass in the intent, we say start activity for result. And now that first activity is going to be expecting a result passed back. And so the only difference is we're passing in the intent. The only difference is we're passing in some ID number, because I might be launching several activities, and I want to know when I get a result back from which activity that was from. So this is just a really nice way of being able to figure out if your activity spawns off, let's say, 3 or 4 different activities, it'll come back on the same method call, namely on activity result. And so you want to know, based on that ID number, which one you launched. So for example, I can launch the camera via an intent, and I want to know that that was a camera result coming back versus a mileage or an oil change date or whatever it is. So it's arbitrary. It's up to you what ID you use, but set it to whatever you want for each item. All right, so back on the on the second activity. So this is the child activity, the second activity. So we say we get the activity result, blah, blah, blah. And then when we're done, so kind of a ellipse here, should have 3 periods. There, we want to set the activity result. So we say set result. And then what we're going to do is pass in activity.result OK. So on that second activity, you can say OK, you can set cancel. And then on the first activity, you might need to know if that was an OK to save that data or that was a cancel. I'll show you all this in actual code, but you'll have it in the notes. And then back in the parent activity or the first activity, we have this method callback called onActivityResult. 3 parameters in this one. The request code, so this is going to be whether the result was OK or canceled, or there's a third one in there, I forget off the top of my head. And then there's the result code that, or excuse me, a request code and result code. Sometimes I mix those up. The result code is what gets passed in when you, so in the previous example, I passed in 999. That's the first parameter. Sorry, 999 is the first parameter. The second parameter is whether it's going to be OK or canceled. So again, I just messed it up, as I said. I have to think about it sometimes what the order is, but if I think for more than 2 seconds, I can usually get it. And then the third part is what we're actually interested in. What's the data that actually got passed back, if any? So again, don't pass too much data back and forth via this method, but I might need to know whether the user saved data or they canceled that result. So we call the super on activity result, and then we'll pull the data out. Perfect. So that's all the notes I have, luckily. I was going to do, so I decided to do some whiteboarding via Photoshop, but let's check our time. Yeah, we're running low on time. So let me just do this really quickly. So again, we have a mileage app. So here's my first activity. Ugh. Here's my second activity. So again, maybe I have it's a list of, there's the mileage, there's the date, there's the last oil change, there's a whole bunch of data in here. And I tap on the mileage. Okay, so I'm going to create an intent, and I'm going to pass in, let's say, that 30,000 miles. And I'm going to set the result ID to, I don't know, whatever makes sense. Usually these are enum types, so it doesn't really matter what the number is. M, it's a number, but whatever. Okay, so then again, it goes to the activity manager. I'm just going to say AM, activity manager. And the activity manager is going to be the one that actually instantiates, creates, and then puts it onto the screen, that second activity. And then it passes in all that data that I passed in. So in here, we'll pull that out of the intent, and then we'll display it in a text field here, or text view, and put that in as 30,000. And then we'll maybe have an OK button or something like that, wherever we want to put it. And then that'll send it back to our first activity. Okay, so I'm gonna hurry real quick. I'm not gonna post that on the repo. I think you guys got it, but I just wanted to illustrate that. I do often do it on the whiteboard, but obviously that's not going to be good for the live stream people. All right, so we're gonna call this just second activity, and sure, why not? Wait for our Android Studio to compile so it gets rid of all this stuff. In the meantime, you can notice our friend, our elephant friend here, that denotes Gradle, and that's what we use for building Android apps in Android Studio anyway. We'll talk about probably next class, or maybe the class after that, a little bit of manipulation of the Gradle files to include third-party libraries and dependencies. All right, so real quick, this is all review, but I'm going to kind of go through it quickly. I want a button. Doesn't really matter at this point what it really does, or this is a straight layout. Let me switch this to a where's my convert? There we go. Layout, horizontal. Let's switch that to vertical. Okay, and okay, that looks ugly. But main thing is, just going to call this launch button. Maybe I'd make it red if I had time, but let's just call it launch button. I'm going to copy that ID. I'm going to go back to my main Kotlin file here, and I'm just going to call this launch button. It's going to be of type button. And I've mentioned this before, but it's worth calling out again. It turns red, and then we get this little pop-up that says android.widget.button. That's the package that we want to include for the module. So I'm going to hit Option or Alt and then Enter to automatically import that. And so you can see on line 5, we get that import. So some of you had issues in the past. And we're just going to do our find view by ID and r.id, and then paste in my launch button. All right, so now we have a reference to that. Going to add our click listener. So on click listener, it's the second one. All right, and so if you remember from the notes, we create a intent. You can call it intent, and it's going to be of type intent. And there's 2 parameters. Actually, this is an overloaded function. It has, what, 5 different versions of this, but for launching second activities, it's always this one. And now it's going, let's say, I'm going to call this details, because usually when you launch a second activity, it's because you want to show maybe a deeper view of the data that you're looking for on that first activity. So again, I have a car, it has mileage, it has oil change dates, whatever. So I click on one of those, I want to show a detailed view of that data. So I'm just going to call this details activity. But obviously that doesn't exist. It doesn't know what type it is. I could go ahead and click on this light bulb that says create class somewhere. I can actually instantiate it right here sometimes. Doesn't look like it. It thinks it's trying to be a member variable. That's fine. We're not going to do it that way anyway, but sometimes that light bulb does help you. All right, so I'm going to either right-click here or I can go to File, New. I just want to get this new menu, and I'm going to go all the way down to Activity. As you can see, there's other objects in that list. And I'm going to create another empty activity. If you remember, when I created this project, I created the project from the template of having an empty activity. You can create a basic activity, which was also another template, and that had the floating action button, etc. So most of the time, I'll just do empty activity. Just starts me pretty much with a fresh activity, just like I have here. So I'm going to call this one details activity. It's going to automatically generate a layout for me. I can now make this the launcher activity, meaning the activity that gets launched when the Android app gets launched. I can check that box and it'll switch it from the other one to this one. And I have a couple other ones, backwards compatibility. We'll talk about that later when we talk about app compat. All right, so I created this new Kotlin file, details activity. So you can see it kind of looked like the previous one, but remember I mentioned we have a Android manifest file, and in our Android manifest file we now have a new entry, XML, called activity, has a name. And the name is details activity. There's a dot in front of that name, and that's just going to kind of be a shorthand for this particular class. So you could type in the full like application dot details activity, but if you just do dot notation, again, it's shorthand for kind of the overall application. So you really don't need to worry about this anymore because, again, Android Studio does that for you. If you wanted to, after the fact, make it a launch, the activity that gets launched, we have what's called an intent filter. This intent filter is actually what makes it the launched activity. So again, if I want to make the details activity the launch activity, I would just move this up within the confines of those two tags, the activity. And to do that is Alt-Shift up and down to move that whole line of code up there. So just as easy as that. All right, so that's what's required when we add a new activity. That manifest file contains each line in that Android manifest file. Every single activity that's going to be launched within your app has to be in that, has to be listed within that manifest. Otherwise, Android, the operating system, doesn't know anything about it. Okay, so anyway, I'm going to get that mileage value out of this. I'm just going to call it, I don't know how to spell mileage. Let's call it miles. All right, that's going to be an integer. Maybe it can be a float, but whatever. And I'm going to pull that out of the intent, which we haven't created yet. And let's say it's an int extra and then a key. So usually with these constants, I'll do, oops, I hit a button apparently. Usually with these constants, I'll name them all uppercase just to denote that this is a constant. But as you can see, it is simply a string. Do not do this. I will show you in a second how to fix this easily. But yeah, don't do this because what's going to happen is you might misspell it, like mileage. It's like I can't at the moment think of how to spell mileage, and then I'd have to go back to the other class. And again, I'll show you a foolproof way of doing that. All right, so I'm going to get this int out of here. And then I'm just going to log, if I turn off caps lock, log D, put my tag in so I can search on it, and then I'm going to simply print out this guy, and I'm just going to do a toString, so it turns it into a string so we can print it out properly. And we have a little, oh, default. Okay, so I forgot one more key. On some of these get extras, like get string, I think passes back a null if nobody passed me a extra that that has a key miles, what is the default? And so for int, there's really no like null value, so you have to pass in a default. If it's signed, you can do like a -1. That way you know if it's -1, then that's the default value. I'm going to put in 0, but you could do that. Okay, so now that we have that class created, now I can kind of finish my implementation of this. So I want the activity manager to create an instance of the details activity. So again, we're just going to pass in that class. So yeah, 2 colons, and then that comes up automatically. So again, we're just passing in a reference to the class itself, and then it'll go off and create it for me. So essentially, it owns that object. And so once we have this intent, we can put some extra data in it. So intent, and then put extra. So as you saw, you can have all sorts of data in here. The first one always has to be that string because it's a key, but we have Boolean, byte, etc., etc. So I think I named it miles. I don't know. Maybe I did. I hope I did. Otherwise, this will come back as 0. We'll find out in a second. I'm just going to put a hard-coded value in here. All right, so we created the intent. We put some data into that intent, and then I'm going to call start activity. Activity. And there's a couple other overloaded functions, and then I'm going to pass in the intent. All right, so that's all I have to do. Once that second activity comes to the screen, onCreate gets called, the whole life cycle goes on, and we can do something with it. Yeah, let me go ahead and play this. I'm going to use this selection for future launches so that window doesn't keep popping. Android Studio, there's something new to update. You'll find that happens a lot with mobile. iOS, there's always something to update. Android, there's always something to update. Okay, so here's our button. We're going to launch that button. Our second activity pops up. Its name is second activity. Obviously, I might put some buttons in here to make it useful. But if we go back to our logcat to see what that data was, there's a whole bunch of stuff in here. I don't know. Actually, I can see where that line of code is, but now it just scrolled off the screen. So I'm going to search on that BSU tag. And voila, here it is. That's funny. This has some old, I had another emulator running when I was testing this out a couple days ago, actually. So that's what that line of code is. Don't worry about that. Here's what we wanted. This is what we actually spit out, was that 30,000. So again, we just spit out that 30,000 that was passed from the first activity to the second activity. All right, so how do we pass data back? Well, let's try it. So let me get rid of this stuff. If you remember from the notes, instead of start activity, we're going to do start activity for result. Okay, and then it'll say, oh, it needs a, I thought it was going to be more helpful than that. It needs an ID. And let's put 42, because that's a good number, right? And Control-O will do all of our overloaded methods. Control-O brings up this nice little window. I can do on activity result, activity result. Okay, and then hit down until you find it. It's the second one, and voila. And the reason I do it this way is because I can never remember the signature, the decoration on this. So on activity result, obviously I can remember, but result code, request code. See, I did it again. Request code, result code, and then the data that's being passed back. All Okay, so real quick, I'm just going to do a log D on this and just pass back. I'm going to spit out the data. This doesn't really, this doesn't really work because we have to extract the key from that. But I'm just going to do, well, let's do this real quick. Kind of running out of time, so I'm going to do the shorthand. This is the result from the second activity. Okay. So maybe your activity, your second activity was a camera. When you take a photo in that second activity, this is actually where you'd get back the image data from that camera's activity. So when you launch the camera, it's actually launching a second activity, and you can get on activity result, get that data, get that image data, and then spit out to the screen. Okay, so the next thing I want to do, okay, it's actually easier if I do this on a button click. So I'm going to set up another button real quick. Let's set up my constraints here. Okay, hopefully that's good enough. Any questions in the meantime? Forgot to keep an eye on my chat.
In your constraints, you click the inside to change the symbol. What does that denote versus what you changed?
This one is locking the left and right margin and the top and bottom margin. So the question was, what did I just click on to make that button center? You can add all sorts of hard-coded numbers in here if you want to, or just go back to, let's see. I set that to 0, so now it's going to be over there. Okay, there we go. So I don't know, it's 161, but that's not really what I wanted to do. Okay, edit undo. There you go.
But that allows you to drag it anywhere you want it and then lock it in position.
Yes. So if I set so the question was, does that allow me to put a button exactly where I drag it? Yeah. So if I put that back to 161 or whatever the value was, on the left-hand side, it'll always be there. But that's probably a bad practice because with different screen sizes, it'll always be 160, whether your screen size is a lot wider on a tablet or on a phone. So don't ever use that unless it's like relative to another button, and you can do a relative layout in that case. But I was ignoring the chat because I wasn't scrolled down, so sorry about that. There's a question that says, is there a limit in the number of activities we're allowed to create? So obviously that was an old question. No, you can, I mean, I'm sure there's some Android underlying limit, but no, I mean, if you're actually creating different classes for your activities and you want to create 100 of those, Android Studio will let you do that, or Android will let you do that. I've worked on projects that probably have that many. I never counted. One of the issues that you will run into in creating Android applications and including a lot of third-party dependencies is actually the method count. I think you're allowed to have 64,000 methods, which you would think is a lot of methods, but when you're including libraries that each have 10,000 methods, 5,000 methods, and you're included maybe 20 of those third-party libraries, you'll actually reach those 64,000 not easily, but probably quicker than you would think. There's this concept called multi-dexing, and you can actually split those methods up between different yada, yada, yada. You don't have to worry about it. But if you ever do run into it, it's kind of a pain in the butt to get working. But yeah, that's called multi-dexing. It is a pain. So sorry I ignored your question on the live chat. I wasn't scrolled down. Anyway. Okay, so, all right, so I have this button. I'm just going to call it return button. And then in my details activity, again, get a reference to it. be of type. So here's one thing I did that I'll spend a little bit of time on. When I got a reference to this button, I explicitly set the button type to button. So I did the variable name and then colon button. All right. And then look at the signature for find view by ID. It's just it's kind of a plain method call. I'm going to do the opposite. I'm not going to explicitly put this in. And I'm going to set this equal to find view by ID. Now, find view by ID doesn't know what it should be passing back, so it uses this template, these two angle brackets here, to denote what it's expecting to pass back. And this is really nice because in Java you'd have to do something. I'm going to Alt-Enter on that to import it. In Java you'd have to do some kind of typecasting on here or use some kind of templating if you're using a later version of Java. But anyway, that's the difference. I go back and forth. It doesn't really matter what you use. If you want to be explicit about your variable declaration, so be it. If you want to do it this way, which is probably what I do most of the time, but as you see, I flip-flop back and forth. You put it there instead of over there. So again, I'll include this as example code so you know how to do this. All right, so we have the button, the return button. I'm going to do on set on click listener, and for this one, we're going to call finish. What finish is going to do, it's going to kill or finish this activity, this current activity, so the details activity. Well, we haven't passed any data back to it yet, but whatever. I can do set on activity result, or set, set, I can't think today. Set result, that's what it is. Oops, hold on a second, sorry. And then the result code. So here's the third one, or the three. I used to know what this means, the first user. I could probably read the documentation on here, start of user defined activity results. I looked into that more, and as I said, I used to know what the result first user was. It doesn't matter. I used to know it. It didn't matter, so I guess I forgot it, which happens to me a lot. But anyway, the ones that we're looking for is result OK or result canceled. Usually if you're hitting the back button, you don't really need to implement the result canceled. But if you do explicitly have a canceled button, or you really need to know whether that second activity canceled out or not, then you can do that. We're just going to do result OK. Again, we're not passing any data back in the intent yet. I'll probably save that for next class because we are running a little bit short on time. And let's see. Okay, finish. All right, so then that'll pop us back into on activity results. And then, actually, I'm going to go ahead and print these out. So log D. ToString log, oops, log D, and the result code, ToString. All right. I'm going to put some breakpoints here. Put some breakpoints in here, and actually I gotta stop that and use our little beetle bug here for the debug. I don't know what that is. Kind of looks like a ladybug to me. Beetle. Gonna put a breakpoint here just for laughs. Hit the button. All right, so now we're inside of the on-click listener. We're creating the intent. I'm going to step over that line of code. Our intent is created, so you can actually see the readout or the debug statement here on the right-hand side. It's going to be of type second activity, or excuse me, it's going to be the details activity, so dot details activity as I mentioned, and then we're going to put that extra It's called an intent bundle, so we're going to put that extra data in that bundle, and we're going to then start the activity. So I'm going to just continue through this. And then in our details activity, our second activity, we get the onCreate. We're going to pull the mileage out of that constant, which I'll fix in a second here. And you can see that in our variables watch list down here, miles is equal to 30. So you'll hear me say this a lot. Make sure what you expect is the value is what the value actually is. Oftentimes people run into bugs or issues. They'll come up to me and I'll just walk through their code and go, yep, your variable isn't set to a proper value. It's not, or it's some other value, and you're like, oh, I switched my keys or something like that. So again, just walk through your code and make sure that you debug it appropriately. We're going to spit that out to the screen, which you already saw. So it says miles, 30,000. And then it's going to get a reference to our button and then set up the click listener. So I can actually remove these breakpoints, continue through, and then switch back to our second activity, which broke. Why did that break?
Your return button is set equal to the launch button.
Ah, thank you. I was doing that while I was talking. Thank you. Yeah, that's why it crashed. If I read the stack trace on that, it would be. Yeah, so this ID does not exist within this activities detail layout. So it goes in this layout. It says, hey, do you have a button? Yes. Do you have the button with ID? Where's the ID on this one? Oh, it's way over here. Do you have an ID with launch button? It's like, nope, crash. Actually, when I go to set probably when I set the click listener, it crashed. But yes, thank you for letting me know. Okay, second button, or second activity. Okay, we're now inside of the, oh, I already did that, sorry. Trying to hurry through this so I can get to the constant. Okay, so there's my second activity. I click the button. We're going to set the result, and we're going to finish. Now let me see if I can put these side by side so you can actually see what's happening. Okay, so then we're going to finish the activity. It's going to go back to the activity result in our first activity. I was going to say our second activity is still on the screen. So these things happen sometimes asynchronously. So just be careful with that. Our on-activity result gets called before our second activity is actually gone. One, because we actually set the activity before the lines of code before the finish call. Okay, and then we're just going to spit all this out to the screen, go back to our first activity. Okay, so that got called here. Let me go and launch the second activity again. There's our second activity. And then on my second activity, instead of hitting this button and then killing that second activity, I'm going to hit the back button. And you can see, actually, I forgot to look at my logcat. Okay, so the 30,000 was printed out, 42. So the first time that this ran, 42 was that request code, and that got spit out. And then my -1, which was actually the result code here, it's an enum type, but that's what -1 is. Don't ask me why -1 is okay. That was something I could ever figure out, but result okay is actually equal to -1. So don't do like a regular Boolean on that or anything like that. And then it spit out the text. Okay, so we're going back through this. Let me go back to my debug. Step over these lines of code, and let's examine what that actually spit out. So 42, 0, and then the line of code. So the difference is, one, I hit the back button, set the result to OK, which is -1. And then I didn't do anything, and I hit the back, or excuse me, I hit the back button, and then it came back as 0. So again, those don't really make sense. In both cases, they're false. So instead, what you'll want to do is say if the result code is equal to result OK, maybe print out that or do something different. Okay, so that's really what you want to do your check for that. Okay, so I promised I would fix my constant because we never have string literals in here. And in the next 5 minutes, I'll show you how to fix this. So again, in Android and any programming that you ever do, if you're putting in string literals like this, you're doing it wrong. So don't ever do this. Instead, extract that to a constant. So in Android and in Kotlin specifically, I'm actually going to put that that constant in my second activity, because if I put that constant in the first activity knows about the constant in the second activity, which is a bad practice. But second, if another activity wanted to launch that details activity, it would also have to declare that constant. So that's why you put it in the second activity here, so that anybody that's launching that second activity, that details activity, can get a reference to that constant from the second activity. This is one example of decoupling our two activities. We don't necessarily want to know too much about the second activity, besides what we need to. All right, so the second one, what we can do is I can right-click on it and go to refactor and extract it. And I can extract it as a variable or as a property. I don't know what function would do, but if I extract it as a variable, it creates a new variable and puts it up there. I'm going to undo that. Again, highlight, right-click, go down to refactor, wherever it is, extract, and I can make it a property of the class. You can say what class is it part of, put it in there, and now it makes it a private variable, which again doesn't really help us because we want access to it in a second class. Well, we could, oops, why did it do that? We could declare it public, which would expose that, but it's really not a good practice. It kind of breaks encapsulation because you probably want to have a getter and setter, but then again, it's just a constant, so like what's the big deal? Well, Kotlin actually has a very nice feature to handle this for you, and that's called a companion object. So if you just type in a couple letters, it gives you the whole syntax for it. And then in here, here's where we can have all of our, what you're probably used to in Java as static or class members and functions. You would actually put them as a companion object. So we're just going to do that. We're going to do you could do something like key underscore miles, and then set that equal to miles. Oops, I have to put it as a value. Now I could just declare it just like that, as if it was a member variable. But in my first activity, what I would do is I would call details activity dot, and you can see the key is right there. And that way the compiler will check any typos that I have rather than a runtime error. So this will always work, whether I spelled miles correctly or not. I don't have to spell it correctly in all the places, and if I ever wanted to change it, I'd have to change it in all the places, which Android Studio makes kind of easy, but this is the better practice in Android and other languages and frameworks. So again, it's denoting that this key exists in the details activity, and this is the same way that the camera activity works. You call camera, and then there's certain properties of the camera that you can pass to the camera activity. But thanks for coming out, guys. That's all I have for you. I will stay after for questions, and see you next time.